All right, let's jump right in. When we think about how a political leader builds authority, our minds usually go straight to the obvious stuff, right? Policy wins, economic growth, all that. But what if there's something else going on? A much deeper, more ancient layer. One built entirely on symbolism. So, how exactly is authority built in our modern age? Well, we're going to dig into a really fascinating analysis that tackles that very question. And its argument is pretty bold. To really get what's happening with modern power, you got to look past the spreadsheets and the official announcements. You have to look at the performance, at the powerful, almost sacred images being used.
So yeah, it's not just about policy, it's about performance. The whole idea we're exploring here is that modern authority is, in many ways, manufactured. And the secret ingredient? It's not just good governance, but a convincing performance of it. It's all about using these powerful, preloaded symbols that, well, they just click with us on this deep, almost instinctual level.
All right, first up, power beyond policy. So, to really get our heads around this, we need to unpack the core idea from the source material, which it calls sacred aesthetics. Honestly, this is the engine that drives the entire argument.
Okay, so the most important term we've got to understand here is archetype. What is it? Well, think of it like a character or a symbol that we all just get instantly. The hero, the wise elder, the rebel. The point the source makes is that these archetypes don't need to win you over with some long-winded argument. Nope, they just bypass all that and plug directly into our emotions, our memories, our reverence.
And this is where it gets really interesting. Look at how this is different from, say, an ideology. An ideology, like capitalism or socialism or whatever, has to be explained. It has to be defended with facts and evidence. It requires a whole lot of persuasion. But an archetype? The source calls it a shortcut. Why? Because it just leaps over that whole messy, logical process. It's all about making you feel the authority, not think too hard about it.
Okay, next up, borrowed figures, inverted meanings. So that's the theory, right? But how does this actually play out? Well, now we're going to get into the specifics with 4 really powerful examples from the source material. We'll see how these classic archetypes are borrowed, and more importantly, how their meanings get completely turned on their head.
Okay, first, let's look at the monk archetype. Traditionally, where does a monk's moral authority come from? It comes from everything they give up, right? Worldly power, money, status. Their entire ethical force is built on this foundation of sacrifice and renunciation.
But here's the twist. The political version flips this completely. It takes on the appearance of simplicity, the simple clothes, the humble talk, but the leader doesn't actually give up a single ounce of power. So what happens? They get this moral halo that makes them seem above criticism, all while their real power stays totally intact, maybe even grows.
All right, archetype number 2, the ideal ruler. Think of a figure like Rama from the epic stories. Their authority isn't just given, it's earned. It's tied to a super strict moral code and, this is key, accountability. Legitimacy here is all about facing the consequences of your actions.
So what's the inversion here? Well, the political aesthetic hangs on to all that powerful language of duty and service, but it quietly gets rid of the accountability part. So you end up with all the authority of an ideal ruler, but none of the burden of actually having to answer for anything.
Okay, on to our third example, the thinker. This is an archetype inspired by figures like Vivekananda. And in this tradition, real intellectual authority comes from engaging with ideas, from debate, even from doubt. It's about having confidence, sure, but it's paired with openness and introspection.
The political version, though, it just cherry-picks the parts it likes. It keeps the image of strength, the feeling of pride, but it throws out all the hard stuff, the inquiry, the dialogue, the self-questioning. Basically, you get the pose of a great thinker without any of the actual thinking.
And for our last example, we have the detached sage. Think of the Buddha. This archetype gets its moral power from being separate from worldly things, from being calm and elevated, and from questioning the very idea of power and hierarchy. And this last inversion is, wow, it's pretty clever. Political detachment isn't about withdrawing from power at all. It's about being insulated from it. The leader seems calm, above the fray, unaffected. But this doesn't weaken their power. It sanctifies it. It makes it seem pure, holy, and completely untouchable.
Okay, next section, appearance versus consequence. So now that we've seen these examples, we can kind of zoom out and see the big picture, the core principle here.
The source material basically frames this as a huge clash between two totally different kinds of morality and politics.
And this table here really lays it out perfectly. On one side, you've got what this source calls aesthetic morality. This is all about how things look. It's about symbols and how a leader makes you feel. It's fast, it's emotional, and it's designed to create loyalty. Then, on the other side, you have ethical governance. This is the slow, hard work. It's about actions and their real-world consequences. It's about accountability, and it asks you to evaluate a leader, not just be loyal to them. The whole argument is that this political strategy we're talking about puts all its chips on the left column, often at the expense of the right.
All right, our next section is when symbols govern. So what's the big deal? What actually happens when a political system starts to rely more on these powerful symbols than on actual governance? Let's get into the consequences for democracy that the source points out. And this right here is a really powerful point. Once a leader is successfully wrapped up in these sacred, archetypal images, the entire game changes. Suddenly, criticizing a policy isn't just a political disagreement anymore. No, it can be painted as an attack on something holy, a moral crime. Dissent stops being dissent, and it becomes sacrilege.
And that kicks off a really dangerous chain reaction for any democracy. It goes like this. First, leadership gets elevated to this sacred level. Step 2, because of that, any disagreement is framed as sacrilege. And here's the critical part, step 3. When that happens, all the normal, messy, but necessary stuff of democracy, debating policy, checking the power of institutions, that all starts to feel secondary, almost disrespectful. And the final domino to fall, accountability. It just weakens, because to even question the leader starts to feel fundamentally wrong.
And this quote from the analysis we're looking at just hits the nail on the head. When sacred figures are reduced to political aesthetics, politics loses its limits. Think about what that means. When these deep, meaningful cultural symbols are just flattened into a kind of political brand, two huge things are lost. First, the symbols themselves lose their real ethical meaning. And second, politics loses its boundaries, the very guardrails that are supposed to keep power in check. So, where does this leave us? Well, it leaves us with a really important question to think about, especially in how we look at politics. Look, every leader uses symbolism. That's just a fact of life. But this analysis really pushes us to ask, where is that line? At what point does a powerful symbol stop being just a way to communicate an idea and start becoming a shield to hide behind, a way to avoid real scrutiny? It's a critical question for any of us living in a democracy, and something this analysis suggests we really need to keep our eyes on.